So the last kind of loop that we're going to look at is called a while loop. And there's a variation of this called a do while loop, but we're not really going to look at this because mostly you're going to use while loops. In fact, you really never have to use a do while loop. There's certain conditions where it might be more convenient, but a while loop is really the one that I think you're going to use a lot more often. So a while loop is a very simple loop. It's actually more simple than a for loop, but it's not quite as powerful because you have to do a little bit more because you have to handle the increment or decrement yourself. So we could actually rewrite this print method to use a while loop instead of a for loop. So if you remember, when we created our for loop here, we looped basically starting at 0, and then every time we incremented our count until it was greater than copies or equal to copies. As long as it was less than copies, we continued to loop, and that less copy that number of times. With a while loop, we can write this exact same code, except a while loop simply has a while statement, and then what's in parentheses is a Boolean condition, either true or false. And if it's true, it's going to continue to loop, and if it's false, it will end the loop. So we could actually do while true here, and this would loop forever. It would create an infinite program. It would never end, because there's no way to get out of this loop. But what we can do here instead is we can say while copies is less than or is greater than 0, then let's print this out, and then we need to modify copies. So we're going to do copies minus minus. So what's going to happen here now is as long as copies is greater than 0, as long as this evaluates to true, then it's going to continue to loop, and it'll print out our text, and then it will also subtract 1 from our copies. So if we put the copies of 5 in here, it would come in 5 is greater than 0, it'd print the text, it would set copies to 4, 4 is greater than 0, so on and so on until our copies hit 0, 0 isn't greater than 0, so then it would exit our loop. So let's go ahead and try this out and see how this would work. We'll change this to print, and we'll print, say, 4 copies. If I run this, you can see we've printed 4 times. And if I change this to 1, you can see it's just printed once. So a while loop, again, a very simple loop, but you do have to be careful that you don't get into an infinite loop, and you just have to make sure that whatever conditional that you create here, that within your loop, you're changing that conditional so that it will eventually be met. You're changing the variable that make up that condition. So the last 2 control statements that we're going to look at here are the break and continue statements. And these statements are really used in a loop or in a switch statement. You saw when we had this print method and we had used the switch statement, we're using break, so we kind of already understand a little bit how break works. What it does is it breaks us out of whatever we're in. Usually that's a loop, or it could be a switch statement. I'm going to show you how break works first in this print colors method. So anytime that you're in a loop, if you decide that you want to exit that loop, you can always call break, and then it'll immediately exit the loop as if the end condition had been met. So we can do this in a for loop, a while loop, a for each loop, any one of those loops. In this case, let's do something here. Let's break out of the loop when we hit green. And the way we can do that is we can check to see if the current color is equal to green. We're going to skip it. And so what's going to happen is we'll get red, we'll get blue printed out, but we're going to skip green and we're going to be done. So the way that we're going to implement this is we're going to use an if here. We're going to check if, and we'll say if, and we're going to use a special syntax here to compare strings. We don't want to say equal equal when we're using strings because strings are objects, and with the equal equal operator, if you compare 2 objects, it's going to check to see if they're the exact same object, not if they're basically equivalent. And this is kind of a little bit of a complex topic with the equals, but you just have to know that when you're comparing objects, if you want to compare the values, especially this is a rule you have to follow with strings, and this is different than C#. In Java, if you're familiar with C#, this is going to seem a little bit weird to you. But in Java, you want to do a string comparison like this. You'll do your string dot equals and then your other string. So we're going to say if green equals the current color, then we're going to break. And this will break us out of the loop. And this does look a little bit weird, but all we're doing here is comparing two strings. We could have written this as equal equal, but that could cause a problem if these strings aren't the exact same string, which a lot of times they're not going to be because they're different memory locations. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens here. I'll change this to print colors, and we'll run this, and you can see it's just printed red and blue. It didn't go through our whole list because once it got to green, this if statement evaluated to true, and it hit the break and it broke out of the loop. Now let's say that we didn't want to break out of the loop. We just wanted to skip green because we don't ever want to print green. We just want to print all the other colors. If instead of a break statement I use a continue statement here, it's not going to break completely out of the loop. What it's going to do is when it hits this continue statement, it's going to be like it hit the end, this end bracket of the loop. It's going to go back to the beginning of the loop. And so it'll print red, it'll print blue. When we get to green, this if statement is going to evaluate to true. It's going to hit the continue, which is going to cause it to skip the print line, and it's going to go back to the top of the loop, and it'll then hit yellow, and then it'll hit orange. So let's go ahead and run this and see how that works. You can see here red, blue, yellow, orange. So basically, a break statement is going to break out of a loop, and it'll work for a for loop, a while loop, a for each loop. And a continue statement is going to end that iteration of the loop and go on to the next iteration of the loop, just like you would hit the end bracket of the loop. So let's go over what we covered in this module. Well, the first thing that we did is we talked about control statements. We talked about the basic idea of a control statement being some way to interrupt the flow or change the flow of your programs, and that without control statements, our programs would just flow from top to bottom without ever choosing a path to go down or doing any kind of looping or jumping around. Then we went through and we looked at each one of the control statements that exist in Java. First, we looked at the if-else statement. We saw how to create an if statement that would check a condition, whether or not it's true or false, and then execute some code. And we could use the else statement to execute another branch of code if the statement was false. Then we looked at a switch statement, and we saw how we could use a switch statement to switch on a particular value and then have a bunch of different cases and execute different code based on each case. Next, we looked at the for statement. We saw that this is one of the simple types of loops that we can create in Java, and we saw how we could use a counter in a for statement to do things like iterate through a list or to count and exit the loop after we've reached a certain count. Then we looked at a for each statement, which is a specialized kind of for statement that makes it real easy to iterate through a collection or list of items. Then we took a look at the while loop, which is perhaps the simplest of loops. It will continue to loop until the condition that we're looping on is false. Then finally, we took a look at the break and continue statements. We saw how we could use a break inside a loop to break out of a loop early based on some condition, or we could use the continue statement to go to the next iteration of the loop. So that covers all of the basic control statements that exist in Java. And with these control statements, now you'll be able to create a much more complicated Java program and actually be able to solve some algorithms. With the knowledge that you've covered so far in the modules up to this point, you should now have the ability to actually write a Java program that would do something useful. Now in the upcoming modules, we're going to get some more tools that are going to allow you to enhance your skills in developing a Java program and to make your programs more efficient. But in